In the blood-soaked soil of ancient battlefields, where Spartan warriors once clashed beneath foreign spears, the true horror did not end when the fighting stopped. Death may have claimed the men, but what awaited their wives back in Sparta was something far worse, an existence more dreadful than dying itself. Imagine a messenger arriving at the city gates, his face grim, his words heavy with defeat. In that moment, a wife's life transformed instantly from one of respect to one of humiliation. What unfolded was a form of punishment so cruel, so calculated, that it turned these women into living warnings for generations to come. The Spartan state, remembered as the legendary military machine of ancient Greece, carried within it a darkness that extended far beyond the battlefield. Behind the gleam of bronze shields and the crimson of war cloaks lay a system of cruelty designed not only for soldiers but also for those connected to them. This was not simply the harsh custom of a warrior culture. It was social engineering at its most ruthless, a weaponization of shame itself. Here lies the paradox. Sparta claimed to honor strength above all else, yet the wives of its fallen warriors were transformed into monuments of disgrace. Women who had once sent their husbands off to war with the iconic farewell, "Return with your shield or on it," now faced a nightmare where neither outcome came to pass. Their husbands had failed, and in Spartan logic, that failure infected the entire household like a spreading plague. The change was immediate, merciless, and irreversible. The moment word spread that a warrior had fled, surrendered, or shown cowardice, his wife was no longer regarded as a person in the eyes of Spartan society. She became a living symbol of weakness, a breathing reminder of what Sparta could not forgive. The respect once commanded by her presence dissolved in an instant, replaced by contempt so sharp that many historians later argued death would have been the kinder fate. And yet, these women had committed no crime of their own. Their only mistake was being bound to men who had fallen short of Sparta's impossible standards of martial perfection. In a society where collective punishment was considered justice, innocence meant nothing. To be the wife of a disgraced warrior was to be contaminated by association, and no effort could cleanse the stain. The psychological punishment began at once. Neighbors who once greeted these women warmly now crossed the street in silence. Friends quietly vanished. Even family members stepped away, fearful that the shadow of dishonor might spread to their own households. This wasn't mere gossip or social awkwardness. It was enforced ostracism, backed by both law and custom. Ancient writers like Xenophon and Plutarch describe this systematic cruelty in unsettling detail. These women were stripped of their rights as citizen wives and forced into a liminal existence, not fully alive, yet denied the dignity of the dead. They became outcasts trapped in a social purgatory from which there was no return. The cruelty was not an accident. It was deliberate, a calculated lesson for every Spartan family. The message was clear. Failure on the battlefield would not only claim the warrior, but would also condemn his wife, his children, and his entire household to disgrace. Sparta had discovered a weapon stronger than the fear of death, the fear of a life stripped of worth. This was control through humiliation, a psychological chain as binding as any iron. But this system was not born out of chaos. It was not the emotional reaction of a wounded community. It was an organized mechanism of social control, perfected over centuries. To understand how such cruelty became normalized, we must look deeper into the society that created it. Sparta, in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, was unlike any other Greek city-state. Here, every aspect of life bent toward one goal: military supremacy. From birth, children were evaluated with brutal efficiency. Male infants deemed weak were abandoned on Mount Taygetus to die. Those who survived entered the agoge, a training system so severe that it molded boys into hardened warriors. And while history often celebrates the endurance of Spartan men, it is easy to forget that Spartan women, too, were shaped by this same military ideology. From girlhood, they were trained in athletics to build strength for childbirth. taught to uphold Spartan values, and indoctrinated with the belief that their purpose was to produce warriors for the state. They were mothers of soldiers, guardians of households, and proud voices of encouragement. This is what makes their eventual treatment so tragic. These women had done everything their society demanded: born sons, maintained homes in their husbands' absence, and preserved Spartan ideals with discipline. Yet none of it mattered. The moment their husbands faltered in battle, the society they had faithfully served turned against them with merciless precision. The laws surrounding this punishment were not vague customs whispered in back alleys. They were codified, understood by all, and enforced with chilling regularity. The ephors, Sparta's 5 annually elected overseers, ensured that the disgrace of a coward's family was carried out with bureaucratic precision. The classifications were cruelly detailed. If a warrior died while fighting bravely in a lost battle, his family might suffer mild shame. If he fled, the disgrace was severe. But if he surrendered, the punishment was absolute. One of the most infamous examples came after the surrender at Sphacteria in 425 BCE, when 120 Spartan hoplites laid down their arms. Their wives endured the harshest humiliation, an inheritance of shame written into their daily lives. Archaeological remains reveal physical evidence of this system of dishonor. Separate burial grounds marked their exclusion. Houses bore signs of disgrace that warned passers-by. Economic penalties added another layer of suffering. Many wives lost access to their kleros, the land allotments that provided their livelihood. Without property or status, some were reduced to begging, while others were forced into forms of labor that free Spartan women were never meant to endure. Festivals and religious ceremonies, once moments of pride, became public stages of humiliation. At times, they were banned from participation altogether. At other times, they were forced to attend in clothing that marked them as outcasts. While other women sang, danced, and made offerings, they stood apart, silent shadows in a society that no longer acknowledged their worth. This public degradation was not spontaneous, it was ritualized. Just as Sparta's military parades were carefully staged, so too were the ceremonies of shame. The wife of a disgraced warrior would often be summoned within hours of news of defeat. Before magistrates, in the crowded agora, she would stand as her husband's failure was announced publicly. Every word stripped away what remained of her dignity, and yet she was denied even the relief of grief. In most Greek states, widows could mourn openly, tearing clothes, cutting hair, crying aloud. But in Sparta, to mourn a coward was itself considered cowardice. Instead, she was expected to remain composed, silent, unflinching, even as her entire world collapsed around her. Any sign of sorrow was punished as weakness. This was the genius and the cruelty of Sparta's system. By targeting not just the warriors, but also their families, they ensured that fear of dishonor extended into every corner of society. For the warriors themselves, death on the battlefield became preferable to the knowledge that failure would condemn their wives and children to lives of humiliation. Sparta had created a punishment worse than death, a living reminder that honor was everything, and failure was forever. In Part 1, we saw how Spartan society condemned the wives of defeated warriors to a life of humiliation and exile. But what came next was even more disturbing. The cruelty was not limited to whispers in the streets or neighbors turning their backs. It became written into the very fabric of their daily lives, etched into their appearance, their movements, and even their most private relationships. What these women endured shows us a side of Sparta far darker than its legendary battles. The physical markers of shame were among the most brutal. Unlike the black robes worn by honored widows, these women were forced to wear rough, undyed cloth, garments that resembled the attire of slaves rather than free citizens. Their hair, which in Sparta was carefully styled to reflect dignity and order, was left loose and unkempt, a visible symbol of disgrace. Wherever they walked, their very appearance announced to all of Sparta that they were bound to the dishonor of their husbands. This humiliation was reinforced by strict temporal restrictions. They were forbidden to appear in public during the busiest hours of the day, when the agora overflowed with citizens. When allowed outside, they had to take designated routes, avoiding the main streets and areas of honor. They could not enter certain buildings, were banned from specific shops, and were even restricted from drawing water at communal wells during peak hours. What seems like a simple rule became a social prison, fencing them off from the normal rhythms of daily life. Religious exclusion cut even deeper. In Sparta, women were central to sacred rites, especially those dedicated to Artemis or Thea and other deities linked to fertility and war. But wives of disgraced warriors were banned from these rituals. They could not join in the Hyacinthia. They were barred from processions during the Chaeronea, and even private offerings at household shrines required special permission. In a world where religion and citizenship were inseparable, this exclusion was not only public shame, it was a kind of spiritual death. The cruelty extended to their children as well. Sons carried their father's dishonor into the agoge, singled out for abuse by trainers and peers. Daughters were branded unmarriageable, their family's disgrace making them undesirable in a society where marriage was a woman's only path to security. In this way, the entire household became a living warning to others, their suffering weaponized as a lesson for Spartan youth. Historical accounts preserve chilling examples of these punishments. During one religious festival, the wives of warriors who had surrendered at Sphacteria were forced to stand apart from the citizens as the names of their husbands were erased from public monuments. They watched while the crowd jeered, some even throwing refuse to underline their rejection. It was a public spectacle of erasure, not just of the men, but of their families' very place in the community. Perhaps most disturbing were the purification rituals forced upon them. Based on the belief that cowardice was a spiritual pollution, these women were subjected to ceremonies that blurred the line between religion and torture. Some were made to fast for long periods, others exposed to harsh elements, and some even endured ritual beatings meant to drive out the weakness their families had supposedly carried. The pain was real, but the deeper message was psychological. They were diseased, and only suffering could contain the contamination. Yet the most chilling form of control was reserved for their marriages. The Spartan state did not simply cast these women aside. It claimed authority over their most private bonds, turning marriage into another weapon of punishment. Once a husband was declared disgraced or dead, his wife was entered into a bureaucratic process that coldly determined her fate. The ephors, Sparta's overseers, reviewed records of her family, fertility, and connections. Decisions were made not for her well-being, but for the military needs of the state. For younger women, forced remarriage was almost certain, but these were not marriages in the true sense. They were calculated breeding arrangements designed to erase the supposed stain of cowardice and replace it with bloodlines from proven warriors. Consent was irrelevant. Women were transferred from one household to another as though they were state property. The selection process added layers of humiliation. Women were sometimes paraded before potential husbands, evaluated openly like livestock. Their previous dignity, education, and personality meant nothing. Only their ability to bear children for Sparta mattered. Ancient sources describe scenes where warriors openly discussed their bodies, debating whether the shame of their first marriage could be bred out by new unions with victorious men. Older women, no longer considered valuable for childbirth, fared no better. Many were reduced to roles resembling servitude, attached to households as rewards for warriors, or even transferred to the perioikoi, Sparta's non-citizen inhabitants, as a way to remove them from the citizen body. In some cases, they became caretakers or workers in domestic spaces, stripped of dignity and reduced to shadows of their former selves. The state even experimented with practices that resemble what we would now call selective breeding. Women from strong military families who had been disgraced by a cowardly husband were sometimes forced into multiple remarriages, moved from one warrior to another in an attempt to restore their bloodline. Their bodies became battlegrounds for an ideology that valued military perfection over human dignity. These arrangements were marked by ritual humiliation. Before remarriage, a woman might be forced to publicly denounce her former husband, declaring him a coward and expressing gratitude for her release. She underwent purification rites meant to cleanse her of his dishonor before being handed over to a new man, not as a bride, but as a resource reclaimed for the state. Even the children of these unions faced complications. Though technically free of their former father's stain, they were often treated with suspicion, caught between two identities. Descendants of cowardice on one side and of valor on the other. They lived in a society where even bloodlines were policed for purity, where your very existence could be marked as questionable because of choices made before your birth. In Sparta, humiliation was never accidental. It was engineered. The clothes on their backs, the paths they walked, the shrines they could not approach, the marriages they could not refuse, each detail was part of a calculated system of control. The wives of defeated warriors were stripped of choice, of dignity, and even of identity. They became tools in a larger machine, one that used their suffering as a warning to others and their bodies as instruments of state policy. This was Sparta's true power. Not just the strength of its warriors, but the way it turned shame into a weapon, ensuring that the fear of dishonor would bind every citizen more tightly than chains. In Part 2, we saw how Sparta controlled these women's clothing, movements, religion, and even marriages. But the cruelty did not end there. What makes this story even darker is how punishment extended beyond the women themselves. Their children, their property, and even their very bodies became targets in a relentless campaign of humiliation. The children born into these disgraced families lived under an unbearable paradox. On one hand, the state hoped they would become stronger than their fathers, redeeming their mother's shame through military achievement. On the other hand, suspicion never left them. Every stumble during training, every failure in the agoge was traced back to the supposed weakness of their bloodline. Success was credited to the state's intervention. Failure was blamed on their family history. They grew up under constant surveillance, reminders that even in youth there was no escape from inherited dishonor. The economic ruin faced by these families was no less calculated. It was a form of financial warfare, poverty imposed not by chance but by design. In Sparta, wealth and honor were inseparable. Land ownership, citizenship, and military service were bound together in a rigid system. To lose one was to lose them all. For the wives of disgraced warriors, this meant being stripped of the very foundations that had sustained their households. The Spartan land system, known as the kleros system, had once guaranteed every citizen a share of land worked by helots, the enslaved population who made agriculture possible. On paper, it ensured equality. In practice, it became a weapon. The moment a warrior was labeled a coward, his family's claim to their land became fragile, subject to review and redistribution. The process of dismantling a family's security began swiftly. Officials arrived to inventory possessions, bronze vessels, furniture, grain, even ornaments, an ordeal conducted publicly to maximize humiliation. Neighbors watched as every item was catalogued, not for justice but for spectacle. Valuable goods were often seized as supposed compensation for the warrior's failure. The loss of helots deepened the crisis. Without their labor, farming became impossible for women suddenly left to fend for themselves. Even if a widow retained a portion of land, she lacked the workers needed to cultivate it. Survival shrank to the smallest plots, where keeping a garden was backbreaking and often futile. The surplus that had once provided food, oil, and poisson for trade vanished overnight. Financial isolation worsened the blow. In Sparta, economic life depended on networks of obligation, loans, dowries, gifts exchanged between households. But for these women, those ties were severed. Debts owed to them went unpaid. Promised dowries were withdrawn. Even inheritances from their own families could be challenged under the claim that cowardice had contaminated the wealth. Writers like Xenophon offer rare glimpses into the desperate measures they turned to. Some took on work considered shameful for Spartan women, weaving for sale, cooking for others, even manual labor normally reserved for helots. Yet even these degrading options were not always available. Guilds could refuse them, and customers risked disgrace by dealing with the tainted. Property rights, normally broader for Spartan women than in other Greek states, nearly disappeared for this group. They could not inherit from disgraced husbands, claim dowries, or retain property they themselves had brought into marriage. The state positioned itself as ultimate judge of ownership, and rulings always fell against them. Many were reduced to survival strategies that blurred the line between citizen and beggar. They gleaned fields after harvest, scavenged wild plants, fished in neglected streams, or worked on the margins of society for the perioikoi, the non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia. Each act of survival further marked them as outsiders, their poverty a living sign of disgrace. The punishment did not end with one generation. It was deliberately made hereditary. Children of disgraced families could not inherit property. Sons were denied full citizenship without land. Daughters, without dowries, found marriage prospects vanish. The cycle created a permanent underclass, a warning that disgrace was not only personal but generational. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this system was the physical violence these women endured. Humiliation, poverty, and exile were not enough. Violence was encouraged as another layer of punishment, not only tolerated but sanctioned by the state. It often began with public beatings. Women whose husbands had been branded cowards might be dragged into the agora, beaten not by officials but by fellow citizens. These were chaotic spectacles where crowds were encouraged to join, throwing stones, striking with sticks, pushing them through the streets. They were communal punishments, masquerading as justice, rituals designed to ensure that no one forgot the price of failure. And beneath the surface lurked something even darker. Ancient sources, cautious in their wording, hint at sexual violence against these women. Though rarely described in detail, the implications are clear. Once stripped of their status, they lost the protection marriage had afforded them. In the eyes of some Spartan men, their bodies became spoils of war, tokens of victory for those who had fought bravely. The logic was twisted but consistent with Spartan ideology. If a man failed to defend Sparta with his life, his wife's body became forfeit to those who had succeeded. Warriors returning from campaigns might claim access, not through law but through custom, while the victims had no one to turn to. The authorities dismissed such abuse as the natural consequence of dishonor. Male relatives, fearing contamination by association, rarely intervened. The physical marking of these women added further cruelty. Some accounts suggest forced brandings or tattoos, permanent signs of their disgrace that invited more abuse. Even symbolic punishments like hair-cutting were carried out with violence, leaving them bloodied and scarred. It was not mourning, but degradation, an attack on their very identity. Step by step, their lives were dismantled. Their children faced suspicion, their land was stripped away, their wealth stolen, their bodies marked and violated. The cruelty was total, extending into every corner of existence. Sparta, in its relentless pursuit of military supremacy, had created a punishment more horrifying than death: to live as a permanent reminder of failure, stripped of dignity, security, and hope. What makes this all the more chilling is the system's cold efficiency. This was not chaos. It was not vengeance. It was deliberate policy, enforced with precision and ritual. Every rule, every punishment, every humiliation had a purpose: to ensure that fear of disgrace ran deeper than fear of dying in battle. And it worked. For warriors, the knowledge that their family would endure such torment was enough to drive them toward death rather than risk survival through surrender. Sparta had found something more powerful than courage, more binding than loyalty. The terror of dishonor extending beyond the grave. In Part 3, we uncovered how Sparta stripped women of their wealth, their homes, and even their safety. But the cruelty did not stop there. The punishment reached a new level of horror when the violence became routine, not just from men, but from the entire community, even other women. These physical alterations, the forced clothing and humiliating hairstyles, served as open invitations for ongoing abuse. Marked visibly, these women were seen as acceptable targets for anyone who wished to display loyalty to Spartan ideals. What made this worse was that children often witnessed the violence. This was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy by the state to instill obedience through terror. Sons saw their mothers beaten and degraded, learning early that dishonor at war would doom their families. Daughters discovered that their dignity and even their futures depended entirely on the battlefield success of men they had yet to marry. The trauma these children endured was not just personal. It planted seeds of generational fear that shaped Spartan society itself. Religious sanction made the abuse even harder to resist. Certain festivals included rituals where the wives of cowards were subjected to ceremonial violence, framed as purification for the community. During the festival of Artemis or Thea, young Spartan men sometimes demonstrated endurance and bravery by inflicting pain on these disgraced women, who were forced to stand as living symbols of failure. To resist was not just futile, but branded as sacrilege, as though the gods themselves demanded their suffering. Archaeological evidence reveals the brutal reality of this cycle. Many of these women bore signs of repeated trauma. Broken bones that had healed poorly, fractures consistent with constant beatings, injuries that spoke of years of abuse. Even in death, indignity continued. They were often buried in irregular or hidden sites, denied the respect of proper funeral rites. Their names were erased from monuments, as if Sparta sought to scrub them from memory altogether. One of the most disturbing aspects was the role of other Spartan women. Those who had raised warrior sons or were married to successful soldiers often took part in abusing their less fortunate sisters. They hurled stones, shouted insults, and even joined in physical assaults. This state encouraged cruelty, shattered any possibility of female solidarity. The oppressed became oppressors, ensuring no united resistance could form. This normalization of violence reached into daily life. For these marked women, casual brutality became routine. Being shoved into gutters, having goods destroyed in markets, being struck by passing citizens, these acts were so common that they barely registered in records. Violence became invisible because it was expected, woven into the fabric of Spartan existence. But the real victims of this system were the children, innocent of their father's actions, yet condemned to lives of systematic abuse, discrimination, and fear. They carried scars that shaped not only their own futures, but also reinforced the cycle of Sparta's brutal culture. From the moment news of their father's cowardice reached the city, their fates were sealed. Sons were branded with suspicion, while daughters were marked as unworthy. The sins of the father lived on in his children, proving that in Sparta, failure spread like a curse. For boys, the nightmare began at age 7 when they entered the agog, Sparta's brutal training system. While all boys faced hardship, the sons of cowards endured a special kind of torment. They were isolated, forced to eat alone, given the worst quarters, excluded from team exercises that built lifelong brotherhood. This wasn't mere bullying, it was systematic, designed to prevent their supposed weakness from contaminating others. Their training was harsher than that of their peers. Beatings were more frequent, punishments more severe, and tasks more dangerous. They were often denied food or forced to endure public humiliation. Instructors singled them out, demanding that they recite their father's failures, denounce their own bloodline, and beg for a chance to prove themselves different. The psychological warfare was relentless. These boys were told constantly that cowardice lived in their blood. Every mistake, however small, was proof of inherited weakness. Every success was dismissed as chance, never fully trusted. They lived under scrutiny, knowing that one hesitation, one slip, could condemn them forever. For daughters, the cruelty took another form. Spartan girls were normally given education, physical training, and social opportunities that were rare in the Greek world. But daughters of disgraced warriors were excluded. They were barred from dances, festivals, and athletic competitions. They were denied the social gatherings where young people formed bonds and future marriages. Marriage prospects for these girls were bleak. No warrior wanted to risk polluting his bloodline. Many faced lives as permanent outsiders, unable to marry respectably in a society where producing warrior sons was a woman's highest duty. Some were forced into arrangements resembling slavery, handed to perioikoi, the non-citizen communities, or even to helots. Others were sent away entirely, exported to foreign cities as if their very presence threatened Sparta's purity. Even education, the pride of Spartan women, was denied to them. While most girls learned skills that made them respected as future mothers of soldiers, the daughters of cowards were left behind. They became symbols of what not to be, their futures deliberately crushed before they could begin. This generational punishment reveals the terrifying depth of Sparta's system. It was not enough to disgrace a man who failed in battle. His wife was humiliated, his children marked, and his entire bloodline crippled for generations. This ensured that fear of failure penetrated deeper than any spear wound. It reached into the very soul of the community. The cycle of shame, violence, and exclusion shows that Sparta's military supremacy came at a horrifying cost. The society that prided itself on strength was built on the suffering of its most vulnerable members, women and children punished for crimes they never committed. And yet, this was the genius and the horror of the Spartan system. By ensuring that the price of failure was not just death but the destruction of an entire family, they created a culture where warriors would choose death every time. But behind the glory of Sparta's victories, in the shadows of their temples and training grounds, were lives broken and futures destroyed. And it is here, in these forgotten stories, that we see the true brutality of a society that valued victory over humanity. From Part 4, we saw how Spartan children inherited not only their father's shame, but also relentless abuse from society. Yet the cruelty did not stop there. Even education, the very thing that bound Spartans together, was denied to these children, leaving them stripped of identity and belonging. While normal Spartan education balanced poetry, music, and rhetoric, alongside the harshness of military training, the children of disgraced warriors were deliberately excluded from this cultural inheritance. They could not perform in choruses, could not recite at festivals, and could not learn the songs that tied the community together. They were raised as cultural orphans, denied not just their father's legacy, but their very right to feel Spartan at all. Some of the most heartbreaking accounts describe the impossible positions these boys were placed in. Sons of cowards were sometimes forced to publicly compete against one another, fighting for the privilege of attempting to restore their family's honor through military service. The price of entry was terrifying. They had to display excessive cruelty, superhuman endurance, and a complete rejection of their father's memory, just for a chance to prove themselves. Many broke under the weight of this pressure, either fleeing Sparta or taking their own lives, confirming the very prejudices the system claimed to guard against. The long-term psychological effects were catastrophic. Survivors often carried trauma that twisted their adult lives. Some became excessively violent, desperate to prove strength. Others bent fully to authority, submitting to anyone above them. Still others fell into despair, never able to escape the shame of their father's failure. Ancient sources note that suicide among these children was shockingly high, a silent epidemic in a society obsessed with honor. The few rare success stories were quickly seized upon as propaganda. Sons who managed to win glory in battle were paraded as proof that Sparta's brutal system worked, that enough pressure could overcome even tainted blood. But for each celebrated redemption, There were hundreds of broken children crushed beneath the machinery of shame. And the suffering was not limited to sons. Daughters, too, faced lifelong punishment. Their futures as wives and mothers, the foundation of Spartan society, were destroyed before they even began. Denied dances, festivals, and marriage prospects, many were condemned to lives of isolation. Some were married off in humiliating arrangements that resembled servitude rather than partnership. Others were sent to perioikoi communities or even beyond Sparta, exiled as though their very existence threatened the state's purity. This generational cruelty ensured that punishment outlived the original crime. The system turned one man's failure into a family curse, spreading shame like a disease through wives, sons, and daughters alike. Sparta had perfected not just military discipline, but social control, ensuring warriors would rather face certain death than risk such destruction upon their families. Fragments of evidence let us glimpse the raw suffering behind this system. Though Spartan history was mostly written by and about its warriors, surviving accounts, inscriptions, and foreign records give us fleeting views of the women and children left in the shadows. One of the most poignant comes from Xenophon's lesser-known writings. He describes meeting a woman known only as the widow of Sphacteria, whose husband had been among the 120 Spartans who surrendered rather than die. Her testimony, filtered through Xenophon's words, gives a rare glimpse into lived disgrace. She spoke of waking each morning to fresh marks of shame painted on her door, of walking to wells before dawn to avoid stones and spit from her neighbors, and of watching her teenage son volunteer for a suicide mission just to escape his daily torment. Archaeological discoveries tell the same grim story. Graves of women linked to disgraced families often bear signs of exclusion. Burials are sparse, with almost no personal items. Unlike honored Spartan women, whose tombs might contain jewelry, mirrors, or tokens of respect, these graves are stark, marked only by the bare necessities. Bone analysis shows evidence of malnutrition, revealing that some of these women suffered hunger in addition to humiliation. Foreign observers also noticed their plight. Athenian and Roman writers, no friends of Sparta, sometimes recorded encounters with these ostracized women. Pausanias, for instance, describes seeing a group of them at a festival, huddled on the margins in rough clothing. He noted their faces bore not hunger of the body, but hunger of the soul, a hollow emptiness carved by years of exclusion. Even he, an outsider, was warned not to speak to them, lest he offend his Spartan hosts. Legal records show the bureaucratic cruelty behind these practices. In one case, a papyrus fragment records the judgment against a woman named Gorgo, whose husband had fled from battle at Mantinea. The document systematically stripped her of property rights, custody of her children, and even the use of her husband's name. The cold language makes the cruelty even sharper. This was not vengeance born of passion, but a deliberate, calculated destruction of her legal existence. Perhaps most haunting are the curse tablets found in Spartan sanctuaries. Lead sheets inscribed with desperate pleas to the gods tell us the pain of women and children who had no voice in official history. One begs Persephone to take her soul, declaring that the living world has already rejected her. Another pleads for the gods to punish those who stone innocent children. These whispers from the past pierce through centuries, reminding us of the human cost buried beneath Sparta's glory. And not everyone accepted the system without question. Even in ancient times, there was debate. Some defended the harsh punishments as essential for preserving military supremacy. To them, collective purity mattered more than individual suffering. One Spartan king, Agesilaus, famously compared it to bronze for a shield. One weak spot, and the entire defense fails. Allowing even a hint of weakness, he argued, would doom the state. But others saw the injustice clearly. Religious voices, including priests and oracle interpreters, suggested that the gods themselves were displeased. They warned that punishing innocent women and children brought pollution upon the city. To them, Sparta's cruelty was not strength, but arrogance that would one day demand divine reckoning. In this clash of perspectives lies the true paradox of Sparta, a society celebrated for discipline and strength, but one that built its power on the suffering of its own people. Behind the bronze shields and red cloaks was a system that destroyed families, erased names, and silenced voices, all in the name of glory. As Sparta's system of cruelty reached its peak, even the gods were invoked to justify it. Priests and oracle interpreters pointed to military defeats and natural disasters as signs of divine disapproval. The very fact that Sparta felt the need to create elaborate religious explanations, claiming these punishments were purification rituals demanded by the gods, reveals an underlying fear that the practices might not have been morally defensible. It was as if the state itself knew it was walking a dangerous line. Yet within this darkness, faint traces of quiet resistance can still be found. Some Spartan women defied the rules in secret, sharing food, offering shelter, and protecting children, even though the penalties for helping the disgraced were severe. Human compassion, though hidden, was not entirely extinguished. A few Spartan men, too, seemed uneasy with the extremes. Historical notes record warriors who quietly refused rewards that included access to the wives of defeated soldiers, though they could not voice their objections publicly without risking their own ruin. Later, Spartan reformer kings, particularly August IV and Cleomenes III in the 3rd century BCE, attempted to address these corrosive practices as part of broader social changes. While they could not openly dismantle the system without undermining the foundations of Spartan discipline, they sought to create limited paths to redemption and restore some measure of dignity to the disgraced. But their reforms ultimately failed, swept aside by resistance from entrenched elites and the unstoppable decline of Sparta's power. The cruelty was too deeply woven into the fabric of society to be easily undone. The damage, however, was already evident. The systematic destruction of families through these punishments left scars that stretched far beyond individual victims. They became ripple effects that weakened Sparta from within, contributing over generations to the decline and eventual fall of one of history's most feared military powers. The lesson is chilling. When a society builds itself on cruelty, that cruelty eventually consumes the very foundation on which it stands. By the 4th century BCE, the demographic collapse of Sparta could no longer be ignored. The population of full Spartan citizens had plummeted from perhaps 8,000 men at its height to fewer than 1,000 by the time of Macedonian domination. While several factors contributed, war, economic inequality, and shifting alliances, the systematic punishment of defeated warriors' families played a significant role. Each disgraced household meant fewer legitimate citizens, fewer heirs, and fewer loyal supporters to sustain the system. Every woman barred from honorable remarriage, every child driven to suicide or exile, represented a permanent loss to Sparta's already fragile citizen body. And here lies the final, most haunting realization. Sparta did succeed in one of its aims. It made death in battle preferable to survival with dishonor. Warriors fought with unmatched ferocity, knowing that surrender would destroy not only themselves, but their families. Yet in achieving this brutal goal, Sparta created something far worse than defeat on the battlefield. It created a society so consumed by its obsession with strength that it could no longer recognize the humanity of its own people. The wives of defeated warriors, condemned to fates worse than death, stand as eternal witnesses to this truth. Their suffering reminds us that any system which sacrifices the most vulnerable for the sake of ideology ultimately rots from within. The greatest tragedy is not only that these women endured so much, but that their suffering was rendered meaningless by their own society. They were not remembered as martyrs inspiring change, nor as heroes who sparked resistance. They were erased, their voices silenced, their humanity dismissed as expendable. And so, Sparta did not collapse in one grand defeat, but in a slow unraveling. The empire that once terrified the ancient world was hollowed out by its own cruelty. A society that placed ideology above compassion and strength above humanity could not endure. For no civilization built on the suffering of innocence can ever last. Today, by uncovering these buried stories, we restore some measure of dignity to the forgotten. We acknowledge the women whose lives were stolen, the children who bore scars of shame, and the families erased in the name of Spartan glory. Their testimony, carved into fragments of records, graves, and whispers of foreign observers, delivers a warning that echoes across time. The true measure of a civilization is not found in its victories or monuments, but in how it treats those with the least power to resist. Sparta, for all its strength, failed this test. And in that failure lies its greatest defeat. One not written on the battlefield, but in the silent suffering of the women it condemned.